"You don't stop a promise," the old sergeant said, his voice cutting through the airport's chaos like a knife through silk. Travelers froze, phones lowered, as the operations manager's hand hovered over his clipboard, threatening to reroute what he saw as just another inconvenience. To the bustling crowd, it was a simple delay in their busy day. To Sergeant First Class William Carter, it was a sacred vow, forged in desert sand and sealed with blood. A promise to bring home a boy who'd taken a bullet meant for him. But what no one knew, not the manager clutching his efficiency reports, not the onlookers checking their boarding times, was that this wasn't just about a fallen soldier. This was about the moment when an entire airport would discover what honor actually looks like. And the real shock was coming, wearing the stars of someone who understood that some things matter more than schedules. Welcome to Legacy Valor. Before we continue this story, let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. If these stories of courage and brotherhood speak to you, hit that subscribe button to support the channel, because tomorrow we have another powerful story that'll remind you why these moments matter. In the heart of Washington, D.C.'s busiest international airport, where announcements drone overhead and the smell of coffee mingles with jet fuel, one man stood like a monument against the tide of rushing humanity. Sergeant First Class William Bill Carter, 58 years old, stood motionless beside a flag-draped casket, his dress blues pressed so sharp they could cut glass. The bronze star on his chest caught the fluorescent light like a small flame, and his shoes, polished to a mirror shine that reflected years of military precision, anchored him to the polished floor like he'd grown from it. His weathered hands, scarred from 23 years of service and 3 tours in Afghanistan, rested at his sides. In his left breast pocket, worn soft from years of handling, lay a photograph. 2 soldiers grinning under a desert moon, arms slung around each other like brothers. One was Bill, younger then, before the grey had crept into his temples. The deep other was Private First Class Jeremy Collins, just 22, with eyes that sparkled with mischief and a heart too big for the body armor that couldn't protect it when it mattered most. The casket beside him wasn't just metal and wood draped in stars and stripes. It was Jeremy, the kid who'd shown up at the VFW hall 2 years ago with a backpack full of nightmares and a 1,000-yard stare that Bill recognized in his own mirror. Jeremy, who'd flinched at car backfires but never at the sight of a fellow. A veteran in need. Jeremy, who'd carried pictures of his mother's chocolate chip cookies in his helmet and mailed crayon drawings from his little sister to anyone who looked lonely. 3 weeks ago, Susan Collins had called Bill at 2:17 in the morning. Her voice broken by grief so raw it cut through the phone line like shattered glass. "They said it was a roadside bomb," she'd whispered. "They said he didn't suffer, but Bill, I promised him if anything happened, he'd come home with honor, full honors. I can't do this alone." Bill had sat in his kitchen, still wearing yesterday's clothes, staring at the photograph on his refrigerator, Jeremy at the VFW barbecue, sauce on his chin, laughing at something stupid Bill had said. "I'll bring him home, Susan," he'd promised, proper. Through the front door, not some back hallway. Jeremy deserves better than that. Now, 3 weeks later, Bill felt the weight of that promise in his chest like a stone. The terminal buzzed. Around him, travelers pulling wheeled suitcases that clicked against the tiles, parents corralling children with juice boxes, businessmen barking into phones about meetings that suddenly seemed insignificant. But Bill heard none of it. His mind was elsewhere, drifting back to a dusty outpost in Kandahar province, where promises were made under stars that seemed close enough to touch. "You think too much, Sarge." Jeremy had said that last night, his voice cutting through the darkness of their shared tent. Outside, the generators hummed their mechanical lullaby, and somewhere in the distance, a helicopter's rotors chopped the air like a slow heartbeat. "Sometimes you just gotta feel it, you know?" Trust your gut." Bill had smiled then, adjusting his gear for the 1,000th time. "My guts kept me alive this long, kid. Yours will too, but guts couldn't stop roadside bombs. Guts couldn't deflect shrapnel." And now Jeremy was in a box, and Bill was standing in an airport that smelled like cleaning solution and broken promises, trying to keep one that mattered more than breathing. Across the terminal, near the massive windows that looked out onto the tarmac, where rain streaked the glass like tears, Susan Collins stood with her teenage daughter Katie. At 51, Susan's face carried the premature lines of a military mother, worry etched around her eyes from years of deployment, fears that had finally horrifically come true. Her graying hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a black dress that Bill recognized from Jeremy's high school graduation photos. In her hands, she clutched a small American flag, the kind given to families at funerals, its fabric soft from nervous handling. Katie, 17 with Jeremy's same dark eyes and stubborn chin, held a bouquet of wildflowers picked from their backyard. That morning, dandelions and clover and tiny daisies that Jeremy used to weave into crowns for her when she was little. Her face was pale, older than 17 should ever have to look, carrying the weight of being the only child left. Bill caught Susan's eye across the crowded space, and she nodded, a mother's silent acknowledgement that passed between them like a prayer. In that nod was gratitude, trust, and the shared understanding that some promises transcend death. She'd entrusted her son's final journey to a man who understood that honor wasn't a word, it was an action, a choice, a line you drew in the sand, and refused to cross. 20 feet away, clipboard in hand like a shield against anything that might disrupt his carefully managed world, stood Tim Peterson. At 34, Peterson was the kind of man who counted minutes like coins and measured success in percentage points of on-time departures. His suit was pressed but not sharp, expensive but not elegant, and his tie was knotted with the precision of someone who'd watched YouTube tutorials to get it right. The lanyard around his neck held 17 different keys and cards, each one representing a door he controlled, a system he managed, a problem he could solve with the right form or the proper protocol. His tablet glowed with numbers that made sense to him. Flight 447 departing in 12 minutes, 93% passenger load, gate B7 experiencing a minor delay due to catering issues, 19 flights scheduled in the next hour. These were problems he understood, variables he could manipulate, chaos he could organize into neat columns and color-coded spreadsheets. What he couldn't organize, what didn't fit into his digital world of efficiency metrics and passenger flow. Optimization was the sight of a casket in his terminal and the quiet dignity of the man standing beside it. To Peterson, this was a disruption, an anomaly that threatened his perfect on-time record and the quarterly report that sat like a weight on his desk. He approached Bill with the measured steps of someone who'd practiced difficult conversations. In front of bathroom mirrors, his clipboard held like a talisman against the unknown. 20 feet became 10, then 5, until he stood close enough to see the deep lines around Bill's eyes, the kind carved by sun and sand and too many friends' funerals. "Sergeant Carter," Peterson began, his voice carrying the practiced tone of customer service training mixed with genuine discomfort. "I want to start by saying how sorry I am for your loss. I understand this is difficult, but I need to discuss the routing for your procession." Bill's eyes didn't move from their forward position, but something in his posture shifted, a subtle straightening, like a blade being drawn. "This is Private First Class Jeremy Collins, United States Army," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "He's going home, and he'll go with the respect he earned." Peterson shifted his weight, glancing at his tablet where red warning indicators flashed like tiny alarm bells. "I completely understand the importance of this moment, Sergeant, but we're in our peak departure window right now. 19 flights in the next 60 minutes, over 4,000 passengers moving through these gates. The service corridor would provide no. The word dropped from Bill's lips like a stone into still water, sending ripples of tension through the immediate area. Travelers within earshot slowed their pace, some stopping entirely, sensing the gravity in that single syllable. Peterson's grip tightened on his clipboard. "Sergeant, please understand, we're not trying to diminish the ceremony. The service corridor leads directly to the departure area. It's actually more efficient. And you'd avoid the congestion of—" "This isn't about efficiency," Bill interrupted, his voice growing harder, like metal cooling in winter air. "This is about a promise I made to a mother who lost her only son. A promise I made to a boy who took shrapnel meant for me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with emotion that Peterson couldn't quantify in his reports. Around them, the normal sounds of the airport seemed to fade. The constant announcements became background static. The rolling of luggage became distant thunder, and even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to lower in respect. Peterson felt sweat gathering under his collar, despite the terminal's aggressive air conditioning. His training hadn't prepared him for this, for the quiet dignity of grief, for the immovable force of a promise kept. "If you refuse to comply with airport protocols," he said, his voice climbing half an octave, "I'll have no choice but to call security." That's when Bill moved. Not quickly, not aggressively, but with the deliberate precision of 23 years in uniform. He turned his head, just his head, and looked directly into Peterson's eyes for the first time. What Peterson saw there wasn't anger or defiance. It was something far more powerful, absolute resolve. "This uniform," Bill said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying to every person within 30 feet, "has been worn by men and women who died for the right of people like you to make schedules and worry about departure. Times. Jeremy Collins wore this uniform when he threw himself on top of me as mortar rounds fell like rain. This flag," he gestured slightly toward the casket without breaking eye contact, "covered boys who came home in pieces so their families could stand in airports like this one, free to travel, free to live, free to make choices." Peterson's tablet trembled in his hands. The numbers that had seemed so important, the percentages and metrics and efficiency ratings, suddenly felt small and meaningless against the weight of Bill's words. "I'm not moving him to a service corridor like he's a cargo," Bill continued, his voice steady as a heartbeat. "He's going through the main terminal, past the people he served, with the honor he earned. That's not a request. That's not a negotiation. That's what's happening." The silence that followed was profound, like the moment after lightning before. Thunder rolls. Travelers who had been hurrying to gates stood still. A businessman in an expensive suit lowered his phone, his conversation forgotten. A young mother instinctively pulled her children closer, not from fear, but from a sudden understanding that they were witnessing something sacred. Peterson opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a voice cut through the tension, like a blade. "Is there a problem here?" The voice belonged to Marine Lance Corporal Alex Ramirez, 25 years old, standing 6 feet away in dress blues so pristine they seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights. His shoes were polished to mirrors, his uniform pressed with military precision, and his bearing carried the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned that true strength doesn't need to announce itself. Alex had been waiting for his own flight. When he'd noticed the commotion, when he'd seen another service member being questioned and felt the familiar tug of brotherhood that transcends branch rivalries. He'd set down his duffel bag and approached not because he was looking for trouble, but because he recognized something in Bill's posture that every veteran knows, the stance of someone making a stand that matters. Peterson turned toward Alex, his voice taking on a sharper edge, born of frustration, and the growing sense that his authority was slipping away like sand through fingers. "This is an operational matter. Airport protocol requires—" "I wasn't talking to you," Alex said quietly, his eyes never leaving Bill's face. To Bill, he offered a slight nod, the kind of acknowledgement that passes between warriors who recognize each other across crowded rooms. "Sergeant, what can I do to help?" Bill felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Here was reinforcement, backup, the kind of support that every soldier knows they can count on when the situation gets difficult. "Marine," he said, his voice carrying new strength. "We're escorting Private First Class Jeremy Collins home. Full. Honors, main terminal the way it should be done." Alex nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Permission to join your detail, Sergeant." Permission granted. Peterson watched this exchange with growing alarm, his comfortable world of procedures and protocols crumbling around him like a house built on sand. "Now wait just a minute," he said, his voice rising. "You can't just—" He never finished the sentence, because at that moment, something remarkable began to happen. From somewhere in the crowd of travelers, an elderly man stepped forward. He was maybe 70, wearing a simple jacket over a white shirt, but on his lapel was a small pin, the kind that veterans wear when they want other veterans to know without having to say anything. "Vietnam," the pin said in small letters, and below that, a single purple heart. The old man, George Miller, though no one there knew his name, moved slowly but deliberately until he stood beside Alex, his arthritic hands finding their way into a position of attention that muscle memory had preserved for 50 years. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His presence was statement enough. Then another veteran appeared, a woman this time, maybe 45, in civilian clothes but carrying herself with the unmistakable bearing of someone who'd worn uniform. She took her place in the growing line, her eyes fixed forward, her jaw set with determination. One by one, they came. Veterans from every generation, some in uniform, some in street clothes, but all carrying the same invisible thread that connected them to Bill, to Alex, to Jeremy's casket, and to each other. An Air Force retiree with his service, cap tucked under his arm, a Navy corpsman with gray in her hair and steadiness in her eyes, a young Army specialist heading home on leave, his duffel bag forgotten on the floor. Peterson watched this unfold with growing horror, his tablet clutched to his chest like armor that wasn't working. This is not allowed," he stammered. "You can't just form a military formation in a civilian airport. There are regulations, procedures." "Yeah," said a voice from the crowd, clear and strong. "There are." The voice belonged to Director Janice Taylor, Peterson's supervisor, and the airport's senior administrator. At 58, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent 26 years in the Air Force before transitioning to civilian leadership. Her suit was impeccable, her bearing unmistakable, and her eyes, when they fixed on Peterson, carried the weight of command experience that couldn't be questioned. Peterson's face went pale. "Director Taylor, I was just following protocol, peak departure hours, passenger flow optimization, the quarterly efficiency metrics." Taylor held up a hand, silencing him with a gesture that brooked no argument. To Bill, her voice softened, carrying the respect of one service member to another. "Sergeant Carter, I apologize for any confusion. You have my full authorization to proceed through the main terminal as planned." Bill felt his shoulders straighten, pride and relief flooding through him like sunlight after storm clouds. "Thank you, ma'am." Taylor turned to address the crowd, her voice carrying the projection training that had served her well in command positions from Ramstein to Kandahar. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have the profound honor today of escorting Private First Class Jeremy Collins through our terminal. Out of respect for his service and his sacrifice, I'm asking everyone to join us in forming a corridor of honor for his final journey home." The transformation was immediate and profound. The busy, chaotic airport terminal, filled with people worried about connections and delays and boarding times, became something else entirely. Travelers moved with quiet purpose, lining the sides of the main concourse, creating a pathway that stretched from where Jeremy's casket waited all the way to the exit doors. A businessman in an expensive suit closed his laptop and stood at attention, his posture straight despite never having served. A young mother lifted her daughter onto her shoulders so the child could see over the crowd, whispering softly about sacrifice and service. An elderly woman with a walker struggled to her feet, helped by a teenage boy who'd been scrolling through his phone moments before, but now stood with quiet dignity. Bill felt tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. Not tears of sadness, though grief was there too, but tears of pride and gratitude. This was what Jeremy had died for, this moment, this respect, this choice that hundreds of strangers were making to stop their busy lives and honor a young man they'd never met, but whose sacrifice had touched something deep inside them. Susan Collins and her daughter Katie approached slowly, Susan's hand trembling as she reached out to touch the flag draped over her son's casket. "Thank you," she whispered to Bill, her voice breaking but strong. "You kept your promise." Bill reached into his pocket and pulled out the worn photograph, him and Jeremy under that desert sky, grinning like they owned the world. With hands that shook just slightly, he pressed it into Susan's palm, closing her fingers around it. "For you," he said simply, "so you remember how he smiled." Katie stepped forward then, 16 years old and carrying the weight of becoming an only child. In her small hands, she held a single daisy from the bouquet, the same kind Jeremy used to pick for her when she was little, the same kind he'd pressed between the pages of his journal during his deployment. With ceremony that would have made her brother proud, she placed it gently on the flag, right over where Jeremy's heart would be. "I love you, Jeremy," she whispered. "Come home safe." The honor guard, no longer just Bill and Alex, but a dozen veterans from every branch of service, took their positions around the casket. Together, with movements made precise by training and reverent by purpose, they began the slow march through the terminal. The silence was absolute. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence. Hundreds of people holding their breath in shared reverence. Phone cameras stayed lowered. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the constant airport announcements seemed to pause in respect. Step by careful step, they moved through the main concourse, past Gate A7, where a delayed flight waited without complaint. Past the coffee shop where the barista stood with his hand over his heart. Past the newsstand, where the clerk had come out from behind the counter to stand with the rest of them. An elderly veteran, the man with the Vietnam pin, raised his hand in a salute so sharp it could have cut glass. Others followed, hands over. Hearts, salutes from those who'd earned the right, bowed heads from those who understood what they were witnessing. Peterson stood off to the side, his clipboard forgotten, his efficiency metrics meaningless against the weight of this moment. For the first time in his career, he understood that some things couldn't be managed, couldn't be optimized, couldn't be reduced to numbers on a screen. Some things just were, and demanded respect, not because of their efficiency, but because of their truth. The procession reached the exit doors, where a black hearse waited, its surface polished to mirror brightness under the overcast sky. The honor guard lifted Jeremy's casket with the same care they'd shown to every fallen comrade, sliding it into the vehicle with reverence that spoke louder than any eulogy. Bill stepped back, his salute steady and true, holding it until the hearse pulled away and disappeared into Washington traffic. Only then did he lower his hand. Only then did he allow his shoulders to relax. Alex Ramirez remained at his side, both men standing in the sudden quiet that followed. "You did right by him, Sergeant," Alex said quietly. Bill nodded, his throat too tight for words. Around them, the airport slowly returned to life, flights to catch, connections to make, lives to live. But something had changed in that terminal, something that couldn't be measured in efficiency ratings or departure times. As travelers began to disperse, many approached Bill with quiet words of thanks. A teenager with a skateboard nodded solemnly, his eyes wide with newfound understanding. A middle-aged woman touched his arm gently, whispering, "Thank you for showing us what honor looks like." Peterson approached last, his face pale, but his eyes clear. "Sergeant," he said, his voice barely audible, "I was wrong. I didn't understand. I'm sorry." Bill looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since their confrontation began. What he saw wasn't an enemy or an obstacle, but a man who'd learned something important about the difference between rules and principles. "You understand." "And now," Bill said simply, "that's what matters." Director Taylor stood nearby, watching the last of the crowd disperse. "Sergeant Carter," she said, approaching with the measured step of command, "if you ever need anything, anything at all, you call me directly." She handed him a business card with her personal number written on the back. Bill pocketed the card, knowing he'd probably never use it, but understanding the gesture for what it was. Respect offered from one service member to another, the kind of respect that transcends rank and branch and years of service. As the terminal slowly returned to normal, Bill walked toward the exit, his dress blues still immaculate despite the emotional weight of the day. Behind him, travelers continued their journeys, but many carried something new with them, a story they'd tell for years about the day they watched a promise being kept. Outside, the Washington sky was gray but clearing, streaks of sunlight breaking through clouds like hope, finding its way through grief. Bill stood for a moment on the sidewalk, breathing air that tasted of rain and endings and new beginnings. In his pocket, he carried the receipt for Jeremy's flowers, a small paper trail of a promise kept. In his heart, he carried the weight of loss balanced by the lightness of duty fulfilled. And in his memory, he carried the image of an entire airport stopping to honor a boy who'd died too young, but who'd lived with honor. That evening, as Bill sat in his small apartment, still wearing his dress blues, he pulled out his phone and called Susan Collins. "He's home," he said simply when she answered. "Thank you," she replied, her voice thick with tears and gratitude. "Thank you for bringing my boy home the right way." Bill hung up and sat in the gathering darkness, thinking about promises and honor and the way ordinary people could become extraordinary when the moment demanded it. Tomorrow there would be another day, another challenge, another opportunity to choose between what's easy and what's right. But tonight, Jeremy Collins was home, and that was enough. In a world that moves too fast and forgets too quickly, some promises still matter. Some stands still need to be taken. Some honors still need to be given, not because it's convenient or efficient or fits into a schedule, but because it's right. Today we witnessed what happens when one veteran's unwavering commitment transforms a busy terminal into a corridor of respect. We saw how the simple act of refusing to compromise on dignity can awaken something powerful in the hearts of strangers. This is the story of Sergeant Bill Carter and Private Jeremy Collins, of a promise made under desert stars and kept under airport lights, of an entire community that chose to pause their busy lives to honor a sacrifice they couldn't ignore. If you've ever seen someone stand up for what's right, someone who refused to let bureaucracy overshadow honor, share their story in the comments below. These moments matter more than we know, and together we can keep alive the traditions of respect and brotherhood that make our communities stronger. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us why these values endure, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a tale of courage, honor, and the unbreakable bonds that connect us all. Because in the end, it's not the efficiency ratings or departure times that we remember, It's the moments when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things, when they choose to honor the fallen, keep their promises, and stand firm for what matters most. Thank you for standing with us. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for understanding that some things, some people, are worth stopping for.